Yo, what's going on, boys? Welcome back to the Juicecast. Now, we put together a lot of videos on UFC 328, previewing it after the fact. There's been a lot of content for this card, a lot more content than honestly I even thought I was going to put together. And here we're putting together more content for UFC 328. In this video, we're going to be matchmaking for every single main event fighter of UFC 328. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So as you see on the screen on this grid, I have all of the main card fighters from UFC 328 on the left, and on the right, there is an empty box. And I'm going to be constantly dragging in the opponents that I think should be next for all of these main card fighters. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So the first fighter that I wanted to talk about is Jeremy Stephens. And obviously, as you already see at this point, I think his next fight should be retirement. I thought, honestly, for a while, Jeremy was more or less washed. He was out of the UFC for some time. The UFC decided to bring him back. I thought it was a weird decision, but nonetheless, he had a couple fights in the UFC. His last fight versus King Green was not a great one, to say the least. He did not look very good, and I think he should retire. Maybe he decides to go over to BKFC or maybe a different MMA organization, but to me personally, I think he should retire. Next, King Green is coming off a very, very impressive performance over Jeremy Stephens. And at this point, although he is 39, he's on a 3-fight win streak and a 2-fight finish streak as well. And I do believe his next fight should be up against a ranked opponent, a guy in the lower half of the rankings. And I think a guy like Beneil Dariush makes a lot of sense next for King Green. Now, as for Beneil Dariush, I've said this a lot. I personally think he should retire. He also is coming off, I believe, 6 KOs in a row. Pretty bad. But after his last performance, he didn't make any mention of retirement. So assuming he still is going to stay in the UFC, I think a fight between him and King Green, honestly, does make a lot of sense. Next, Joaquin Buckley is coming off a loss to Sean Brady, a pretty dominant loss to Sean Brady. 30-25 loss to Sean Brady. Honestly, I don't know the last time that I've seen a 30-25 scorecard. Really, really impressive performance from Brady. But as for Joaquin Buckley, now at this point, he is on a few fight loss streak, and I do think he should fight somebody behind him in the rankings. Currently, at the time of recording this video, he's number 9 in the rankings. I think after that loss to Sean Brady, he'll probably be number 10, maybe number 11, and I think his next opponent should be someone who fought on that same card, and Amasov. Now, Amasov, as I said, fought on the same card, and he looked incredibly good against Joel Alvarez. But even after that performance, and even after Buckley's performance, Buckley still probably is going to be higher up in the rankings as compared to Amasov. So because of that, I think matching these guys up against each other makes a lot of sense. Next, Sean Brady is coming off that dominant performance over Joaquin Buckley that I was just talking about before. He found takedowns constantly in rounds 1 to rounds 3, and once he found those takedowns, he was incredibly dominant on the ground. And something that I've been saying a lot, honestly, on my live streams on Juicy MMA, and I'll say it again, is once Sean Brady's able to get on top, this guy is one of the best fighters in the UFC. I think he's a top 5, maybe even top 3 fighter once he's able to get that position. He's nasty from that position. Pause. But he's really, really good. And because of that great performance that he put over Joaquin Buckley, I do think he should get a top 5 opponent. And because of that, I do think his next matchup should be up against JDM. Now, JDM obviously is coming off a couple of losses in a row against Islam and Carlos Prates, and I think he should fight behind in the rankings. So a matchup between Sean Brady and JDM does make a lot of sense. Next, Waldo Cortez Acosta ended up losing somewhat of a close decision victory to Volkov, and in my opinion, I think he should be fighting someone behind him in the rankings, and a matchup that does make a lot of sense is him versus Chimaev. Now, Chimaev is a guy who's coming off a pretty decent victory in his last fight, and also Chimaev is clearly a guy that the UFC likes. In his UFC debut, they really tried to put together a fight between him and Curtis Blades. They tried to put it together like 3 or 4 times until eventually the fight finally happened. Clearly, the UFC sees something in this guy. So I think a matchup between Chimaev and Waldo Cortez Acosta does make sense. Next, we have Alexander Volkov. Now, Volkov ended up slightly beating in a close decision Waldo Cortez Acosta, and I do think a matchup for him next that makes a lot of sense is him against Josh Hokit. Now, I do know Josh Hokit does have a fight at the White House scheduled against Derek Lewis, but assuming he is able to beat Derek Lewis, which in my opinion, I think he will, I think a matchup between him and a top 3 fighter in Volkov makes a lot of sense. And outside of Josh Hokit for Volkov, he's kind of in a weird position here where the interim belt and even the undisputed belt are more or less taken up for quite a bit of time, and he doesn't have too many options. So I think him versus Josh Hokit after Hokit beats Derek Lewis does make a lot of sense. Next, Tatsuda Taira ended up coming off a pretty dominant loss against Joshua Van. And because of that, I do think he should fight back in the rankings. And I think a fight between him and Loney Kavanaugh makes a lot of sense. They both have the same opponent that they were able to beat recently in Brandon Moreno. Both of these guys are young. Tatsuda Taira, obviously, as I said, is coming off a dominant loss for the belt. And also, Loney Kavanaugh is coming off a dominant performance against Brandon Moreno in his last one. They're pretty close to each other in the rankings. I think a fight between themselves honestly does make a lot of sense. Next, Joshua Van. I think this one is pretty obvious. A fight between him and Alessandro Pantoja does make a lot of sense. Obviously, they fought originally back a couple of months ago, or last year, I should say. And obviously, it ended in very unfortunate fashion for Pantoja. He ended up breaking his elbow. I think a rematch between both these guys does make a lot of sense. And especially after the dominant, historic, honestly, performance from Joshua Van at UFC 328 over Taira, I think this fight gains a lot of steam and becomes a lot more interesting all of a sudden. Next, Khamzat Chimaev came off a close decision loss to Sean Strickland in one of the weirder fights of this year, which honestly is saying something. But nonetheless, I think it's pretty clear this guy is moving up to the light heavyweight division. And at this point, considering he is coming off a loss, he's not going to be fighting for that interim belt at the light heavyweight division. So a fight that I think makes a lot of sense next is him versus Paulo Costa. Now, these two guys clearly have a lot of beef, and all of a sudden, it makes a lot of sense. Paulo Costa is coming off a 2-fight win streak. Also, he's had a lot of success, it seems, at the light heavyweight division. Khamzat Chimaev had a lot of trouble making middleweight. I think he's going to move up to the light heavyweight division, I should say. He actually said it before the fight. He said it after the fight. A fight between both these guys just make too much sense. And they have the beef. It'll probably sell really well. And I think a 5-round co-main event on a pay-per-view card between Khamzat and Paulo, honestly, makes a lot of sense. But lastly, Sean Strickland. Sean Strickland ended up defeating Khamzat Chimaev in pretty interesting fashion, I guess I'll say, finding a decision victory over Khamzat, regaining the title, becoming the champ once again at the middleweight division. And all of a sudden, Sean Strickland becomes one of the most unlikely Hall of Famers in UFC history. It's kind of crazy to see what this guy has been able to do. Beat Israel Adesanya when he was somewhat in his prime, beat an undefeated Khamzat Chimaev when he was in his prime. Also, along the way, beating a lot of other top contenders as well. Fluffy Hernandez, others. There's been so many guys that Sean Strickland has been able to beat over the years, and he has an incredibly impressive resume. So because of that, I think his title defense should be up against Nasruddin Imavov. Now, we were talking about this a lot on Juicy MMA's live streams, on my own live streams on the main channel, but I personally thought Imavov should have got the title shot against Khamzat Chimaev, but obviously after Sean Strickland put on a great performance over Fluffy Hernandez, he all of a sudden stole Imavov's title shot against Khamzat. But now that Strickland is the champion, I think a rematch between him and Imavov does make a lot of sense. Obviously, they fought together against each other, I should say, in the past, and I think putting together a rematch at this point honestly does make a lot of sense. So that is my matchmaking for UFC 328, or I should say after UFC 328. Let me know what you guys think down below in the comments. Do you guys agree with the matchmaking? Do you guys not agree? What are your thoughts on UFC 328 as a whole? But until the next time, peace out, fellas.